Hey there again. I received a question from a former student. They have another project they're doing for a different person in the program. I thought that this would be useful to answer for other people that are interested in this question. I'm going to leave the student's name anonymous, of course, but I'll read the questions they kind of sent me verbatim, and then here's some interesting stuff. These questions largely surround, if you wanted to get into the industry of disaster risk reduction or emergency management or these sorts of things, the things that we kind of talk about on this channel, uh, what's involved in that? What sort of things should we know? So that's kind of like the general idea here. In thinking about this video, I'm thinking that we'll probably also do a follow-up to this at some point, breaking down some of the answers I'm going to give further. Once again, this is going to be another one of those I just kind of riff on something, give my initial idea or response to these sorts of questions. And if you want something more detailed or further, please let me know. Okay, the first question, what skills are most desirable for entry-level applicants within your area of the industry? Now, the industry could mean emergency management. It could mean disaster risk reduction. It could mean business continuity, which is something that I tend to be a bit more subspecialized in. There's a bunch of different things that this could mean. In general, my area now tends to be more consulting based or more private sector based. We still do some work in the academic sector, and we do some in government and in the public sector, but by and large, the work that we do is expertise coming in to assist with organizations. In some cases, we'll kind of run their entire program, but usually we're assisting on. It's a very specific skill set. I'm going to answer for that, and then I'll give some of my exposure to other kind of adjoining industries. For what we do specifically, really the way I read this is if I was looking for someone, if I was, hiring, what would I look for in an applicant? Specifically someone who does this, because we'll hire people in non-expertise roles, but for ones with this expertise. Generally, when I'm looking for new applicants in this area, I'm looking for somebody that I can train into being a replacement for myself. I basically want to have the confidence in staff that when I send them to a client, that they're able to do as close to as good of a job that I would expect that I would do, or better, which would be the dream, right? Basically, I want everyone to provide an excellent level of service, essentially. So really, I'm looking for being able to clone myself in terms of performance, personality, whatever, but like in terms of performance and capability, etc. As far as the skills that would be required to do that, I don't actually need them to know all of the specifics around continuity or emergency management or risk reduction. I need them to have the transferable skills that are necessary in order to learn it. So things like a basic understanding in project management. They wouldn't necessarily have to have a PMP, a project management professional designation from PMI, the Project Management Institute. They don't need to have that, but they need to understand like what scope is. They need to be able to basically, when I set out a project, or if they're asked to set out a project, they need to be able to take the components of said project and then sort of break it down, understand what's in scope, what's not out of scope, and not basically start doing work that the client isn't asking for. That is not a skill that is often taught very well in academic institutions, in my experience, and that's something that I kind of want them to have that they usually don't. So that's kind of the first skill there. The second would be some form of presentation skill. If you're talking a lot in this industry, you're doing a lot of negotiations, you're doing a lot of getting different people with different opinions together and having them hopefully come to a common understanding or common goal. You have to be a good communicator. You don't have to be a leader among leaders, but you need to be able to communicate. If you're not an effective communicator, if you can't present, it's a tough uphill battle. So that's the second thing. So one, project management experience in some way. Two, good communicator. Three, in general, you need people that are relatively independent, don't need their hand held. When they're onboarded, like they might not know how to do this. There's shadowing, of course, and there's like, we'll show you how to do it. And this is true broadly speaking across emergency management and all of these fields in general. You're the person that's not supposed to be difficult. So if you have a room, in the room, there's a disaster and there's an operation center, and you're going to have, the chiefs of certain emergency services come in and politicians that have certain interests and lawyers and whoever else. Some of those people are going to say, when's lunch? And they're going to be thinking about when's lunch. You are not the person who's supposed to be saying when's lunch. You're the person who's supposed to basically make sure that that question is answered so that they can get back on task. You're not supposed to be someone that has to be handled when you're basically the handler. That's another thing. A lot of people get kind of weeded out of this industry when there's a lot of, well, suck it up, buttercup, better toughen up. But the reality is that you're kind of that person in the room, so you're not really allowed to complain. Someone who is very quick to complain, if you have, a reasonable criticism of something, you have an accommodation needs to be met, no problem. But it's when you're viewed as a complainer, we lose clients. Like, you can't lose clients. It's not worth it. You're too high of a risk. So it's really important to not be kind of viewed as that complainer. So the skill of being able to kind of navigate that, this is part of communication skills, but it's not just the ability to present, but it's the ability to kind of negotiate, the ability to get what you're looking for without being seen as a bother. That's important. And then broadly, general critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is incredibly important in this area. Very often, you end up being tasked with basically going into an organization and talking to the owners of said organization and convincing them, basically telling them that they're wrong or that they lack thinking skills, and then having them thank you for it. This is delicate. And, your intent isn't to do that, but it will often come across that way, because what will often happen is you'll be put in a position where there's a risk that has to be addressed, and the questions that will have to be asked, once they're asked, are so obvious, or they appear to be so obvious, not necessarily that they are so obvious, but they appear to be so obvious, that the principal, the business owner, the leader, whatever, will often get kind of like looks from their team of, hey, looking for guidance here, because it may appear that they look dumb. And people will go into face-saving mode, especially if they're proud. And you don't want that to happen, but you kind of create those situations fairly often with a lot of these risks. That's delicate. And usually when there's those sorts of things, I'm going to be the one doing it. I'm not going to put like a new hire in. But the easier it is for someone to kind of navigate those social situations and have the critical thinking to think, okay, I'm about to introduce this. I can identify this problem. This is the sort of reaction I can expect from it. The easier the learning process is going to be. Extra stuff on critical thinking. A lot of this is data analysis. You're going to be looking at current events. You're going to be looking at, we have this client, there's these things that happened recently. We can expect these risks will probably occur. You're going to be trying to kind of predict the future a bit. You're going to be trying to anticipate things before they actually happen, and surely before the client does. Otherwise, if they're paying you to basically predict things before they predict them, and, they're faster than you, why are they paying for you? There's some of that. And critical thinking is absolutely required for that. And in general, with critical thinking, once again, one might be surprised just how few people coming out of like current university cohorts really have critical thinking skills. It's pretty scary out there. And if you are very good at critical thinking, it puts you really far ahead of a lot of people. It's pretty scary. Fifth thing that I want to kind of add in is writing ability. Many people can't write. They really can't. A lot of people are relying on AI to write for them, which is a decision. But the end product has to be usable, and the end product has to be something that the target audience is looking for. If you're writing a briefing note, you need to know what the organization is looking for in a briefing note. What are the objectives that are supposed to be met with this thing? I'll get a meeting note for something where I know like the executives around the table are going to want to read something very, very quickly. That's basically napkin math. That's 30 pages. And it's useless. It could be brilliant, but it doesn't matter because they're not going to read it. It's too long. Similarly, you'll get a very well thought out proposal on something that might be a bit longer, and they have all these great ideas, but then there's no references, and there's no citations, and there's no evidence, and it's going in front of people who only care about evidence-based reasoning, and the first thing they're going to do is flip to the back and see if there's citations, and the second that there aren't any, they throw it out. You need to know your audience, and you need to know how to write for your audience, or all your work gets thrown out anyways. And teaching people how to write is a lot more difficult than teaching people, how to apply their skills to the field. Okay, second question. From your perspective, what areas do new professionals tend to struggle with most when entering the field? Critical thinking. They tend to struggle. They tend to struggle with meeting the culture of the organization they're in. So depending on if you're going into the private sector, the public sector, where you're going, different social norms will be expected. If you're going into a public sector institution within like a police force or a fire service or something like that, Many of these organizations are very hierarchical, and there are people who are in a leadership position who had to climb a hierarchy of a lot of basically bowing and saluting and being told when they're allowed to talk. It's a very rigid structure, and you're often going in as a administrative assist in some form, or some form of person that's assisting with a very high level with someone who has climbed for sometimes decades. And many people that are used to, like, the private sector, for example, you go into that environment and they're used to being called specific titles with specific sorts of decorum and respect and etc. And that culture shift can be jarring. There are advantages and disadvantages to that sort of culture, but if you don't get used to it fairly quickly, you can be viewed as like a bad fit, and that can be a problem. Flip side, if you are used to dealing with high-level executives in a business, they often aren't looking for the same type of decorum. They're still looking for decorum very often, but they're looking for basically get to the point. They're looking for a completely different type of environment generally. A lot of these people, very high paid, very high skilled, they can modify their behavior and they can, try to make you more comfortable. They know how to do that. But once your work for someone to socialize with, then your work that they don't want to have to do. That's one place that newer professionals may struggle, kind of getting used to the exact organizational culture. Another example here, this is something that's fairly publicly known. Amazon, one of the largest employers in the world right now, as far as I recall, they hate PowerPoint. They hate it. They want everything in a written document, basically, that is incredibly short form, and then, write it down, give it to me, basically point form. And they do not want PowerPoints. They hate it. There's a lot of tech firms that are like this. And if you're someone who really, really is strong with PowerPoint and you don't like short notes, that's going to be a culture shift for you. When you're getting into this sort of field, very often there's no one common thing that all, like, emergency management departments or all continuity departments will have in common. You're going to have to adapt to whatever organization you get embedded into. So if you work for Amazon, Canadian Tire, the city, the government, like the federal government, for example, you'll still be doing emergency preparedness or business continuity. The skill set is the same, but the way you apply it and the culture you work within is completely different. Another thing that people often struggle with when they get into the field is getting used to how dark or depressing a lot of this stuff can be. It's one thing to hear about it academically. It's another thing to be in the middle of a crisis or a disaster, especially if you're working for an emergency service. Hearing about a pandemic and then working in a hospital in the middle of COVID are two completely different realities. Having to respond to a disaster, hearing in a case study, well, they only had 10 minutes and the case study that you watched a movie on was 2 hours is one thing. Only having 10 minutes and, that level of pressure to make a decision that could affect thousands, tens of thousands, even more lives, being in the pressure cooker is a completely different environment than the other. And if you're new in the industry, you're not going to be the one making the decision, but you're in the room pretty often when it's being made and you're exposed to that. And someone who has a lot of pressure on them has to make a decision and they need your help to make it now. There was a really good West Wing episode, great show, by the way, about this a while ago. I want to tell a story here because I think it's something you can look up and then you'll kind of get the point. There's a new hire for a special advisor to the President of the United States for the Situation Room, a new military advisor. And the president or the chief of staff or somebody asks this new person for, 5 strategies to address some sort of crisis. And then the guy basically says, I'll have it to you within, end of day, or some longer time period. And then 3 people that are essentially, running the country, chuckle, laugh, and say, I'll see you in 30 minutes. It's like you think you have time, you don't. Get it done, right? That sort of time scale. Sometimes if you're working in response, especially, you work on a way faster time scale than you're used to. And that sort of pressure is very different. And the things you will see are the types of things that you can't really show on TV. It's kind of getting used to that is a big deal. In addition to this, another thing that I struggle with, depending on where you work, you may be working horrendous hours, and getting used to that is quite something. During an ongoing crisis, it is very possible that you're working 18-plus-hour days. You might not have the time to go home to sleep. During certain disasters, especially if you're working in a more remote location, you may be essentially locked in a building, working 18, 19-hour days, sleeping on the floor of the office or in another room, essentially. And, just if you have a waking hour to manage crisis, you're managing crisis. Here's an example. One thing that has been said quite a few times from people that have been in this industry a long time is you really need to thank the custodial staff, because if the bathrooms stop working and everyone's been living there for a month, politeness leaves the room. I'll put it that way. Sometimes the working conditions you're working in, due to the necessity of the situation, they're very rough for people that aren't used to that. It's not that these workplaces, don't follow labor laws, or that they're forcing you to do this. It's just kind of the culture of the organization is often that, you have a situation where you're worried about 100,000 people dying, and any minute you're not working is a minute where another person could be saved. And that sort of pressure that people in this industry tend to put on themselves is a big deal. And learning how to manage that, learning how to decide when you need to rest, learning how to decide how to be most effective, that's an adjustment. I highly recommend, if you're going to get into any part of this field where you're going to be dealing with these sorts of things, that you get a mental health professional to work with before you enter the field to help kind of prepare you for dealing with some of this stuff. That sort of like preventative mental health work is not talked about enough, I think, and I would argue that it's useful for virtually any first responder, frankly. But anyone who works with this type of stuff, you should get a hit on that at the start. Yeah, that'd be mostly it. This field's pretty good about teaching you what you need to do. People don't tend to struggle with like risk assessments and stuff. If you go in with enough transferable skill sets, you pick that up pretty fast. The content of the field you pick up pretty fast. It's the transferable skills that sometimes are rough. Are there particular skills or traits that individuals could strengthen prior to entering the workforce to improve their success? I think that's pretty much the same answer as the first question. Improve your project management skill sets, improve your conversational ability, your ability to speak, your ability to negotiate, your ability to talk. If this is a video game, raise your charisma score. That's pretty much it. That, and then once again, critical thinking skills. You really, 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 really need to know how to not, you need to know how to think, okay? You do, or you get lost. Traits, I would say that there is going to be a tug of war between compassion and becoming jaded. On one hand, there's going to be, the need to help and the feeling that like you want to help people. People who get into this industry tend to be that way. But on the other hand, you may see some stuff and there may be things that are like adding up on the chart of reasons to lose faith in humanity. It's important to kind of get ready for that and to put that in context. The same can be said for many doctors that like work in an emergency room, for example. They see a lot, and thinking about how to prepare yourself and get the right sort of traits so that you can become most effective in that. Have it be a good thing and not a bad thing. Like there's ways to think about it that are productive instead of harmful, right? The way I think about things, for example, and this is my method, I don't think anybody else necessarily should, but this is the way that I've been thinking about it. I like puzzles. I really, really like puzzles. And this industry has provided me basically some of the most interesting puzzles. The sorts of puzzles where every answer is a lose. No matter what answer you have to the question, you're losing. And your objective is to lose as little as possible. It's like a controlled loss scenario. Sometimes you have winning solutions, but generally you don't. And when I hear about a new case, a new thing by a new client, even if it's something horrible, for me, in the back of my mind, I go, awesome, we have a new challenge. And it's a challenge, right? It's okay, I have to optimize this as much as possible to have the best outcome for whatever. And I view it through the lens of a new challenge, which is exciting, not through the lens of all this horrible stuff just happened, I have to process this now. And I basically categorize everything into relevant and irrelevant information to meeting whatever objective is being set by the organization, and I just go to the challenge. That's my method. Other people's methods will work for them, but you need to find out some way to do that, and my sort of personality traits for this worked for me. So when you're entering the workforce in this also, emergency management, disaster recovery, all these fields really are very, very small. Most people in it tend to know each other, or they're only 1 or 2 degrees really removed from each other, so everyone either knows each other or can find each other pretty fast. In my experience, virtually everyone is nice. Virtually everyone is trying to help. I haven't come across a lot of drama or a lot of office politics really in this field. It's all been just kind of good. Now, that's kind of the baseline. So if someone comes in and is difficult to deal with, they stick out. So in my experience, because the base expectation that I have for people in this field is that they're awesome, if you're not awesome, it's really obvious. So try not to be difficult. Don't gossip, don't create issues. It's like a professional family that likes each other, kind of. Yeah, it's some of the most pleasant office environments I've ever seen are in this field, which is really good because everyone kind of has to work together to deal with the bad and horrible thing that's going on. And they don't have time to really not be in the same boat rowing together, right? Everyone has to kind of be together on this, and that's kind of where they are. It's a very collaborative industry that way. You don't really have intellectual property for a lot of this either, so people aren't worried about ideas being stolen. Like, they rampantly share ideas all over the place. It's just very collaborative in general. Kind of get ready to be into that headspace. Okay, last question. What skills or capabilities are typically developed on the job for someone entering without prior field experience? Okay, so if you're going to enter and you don't have field experience, what are you going to learn? You're going to probably learn about a HIRA, hazard identification risk assessment. You're going to learn about a HIRA. You're going to learn how to do disaster risk reduction style risk assessments. You're going to have to learn how to think about risk in a very specific way. That's basically guaranteed. You're going to have to learn about how to apply different types of risk controls to different sorts of situations. Usually this will be put into like an emergency management pillar or disaster risk reduction pillar, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery sort of system. But you're going to learn about risk controls in some form. You're going to have to think about how to apply them. You're going to need to learn how to talk. You're probably going to need to learn how to deal with an incident management system. So you'll probably have some sort of, it looks kind of like email. It will usually have some integration with GIS, geographic information systems, so like maps and stuff. So you'll have like different like sort of things that come in at like ticket levels, and there'll be like red for like it's really bad and green for it's like, watch it or whatever. They'll have like a priority system or like, it's level 1, 2, 4, 5. And then it'll be like, this is what's happened, this is location. And very often you'll be tasked with sort of kind of managing that information and figuring out where it's supposed to go. There's going to be, depending on where you are, but especially in emergency management for sure, you're going to have to learn how to kind of coordinate calls, how to get people in a room, how to kind of run the meeting. There's a lot of those sorts of skills that you're going to have to learn, and that you may think that you knew them before, but depending on where you come from, it's a bit different when you're in the middle of managing an emergency. Personalities, the urgency, just it's a bit different. On geographic information systems, depending on where you're getting into, you might not know what GIS is. You might be learning about GIS pretty fast. Even if you're not doing it, you're probably interacting with it. And then there's all sorts of organization-specific stuff that you're probably going to learn or have to learn. If you're working in a government and you're working right under in the Canadian system under a minister or a deputy minister, in the American system under the secretary of whatever, the deputy secretary, etc. If you're working directly under the highest level appointee that reports to the political leadership, you probably have to think about navigating what the political element is going to want or is going to need. Depending on how many degrees removed you are, there is sometimes a sort of balancing act that has to be played between what you think is the best thing for the public, what the politician needs in order to sell it. The lower down the totem pole sort of you are, then the more you're focused on sort of your thing and, doing what your manager needs to justify it. And the higher up you go, the more the political element sometimes is required. And you might think, entry-level position in this is pretty low down the totem pole. It's not necessarily. Some of the entry-level positions in this field are very, very close to one of the highest level people in cabinet. You're sometimes only 3 or 4 rungs really removed from someone who leads an entire basically wing of a country because the industry is so small. So sometimes you end up learning, how the world works really, really fast. That sort of like adaptability is important. And then once again, you just don't be a bother, and you need to learn how to figure out what stuff is relevant and not relevant so you're not wasting people's time. If you start answering a question that wasn't asked because you weren't able to apply critical thinking to figure out what the question that was being asked is, you run into problems. What your initial manager or director is really going to like is when they get a piece of paper from you that they can do no edits on and they just pass it up and you don't create work for them. They love that. When they have to take what you did and basically redo it all or do it themselves, why are you there in the first place? Is kind of the question they start asking. Now, look, if it's your first week, I get it. But the quicker you can get to, I didn't need to do anything for this, perfect, I'll just send it up, the more they like you. What specifically depends on what tasks you're doing. Yeah, that's pretty much it for that, I think. If you want to follow up on this, let me know. I probably will do it anyways to give you examples of some of these breakdowns, what these things look like. But yeah.